Hello and welcome. Before you continue, do be aware that I sometimes discuss sensitive or uncomfortable topics in my videos as they relate to the books I am reading or writing. Please take a moment to view any content warnings in the description. Thank you! This is a patron-requested review. If you would like to request a book for me to read and review and help me work towards audio adaptations of my own works, check out the link to my Patreon in the description. 13 Roget requested that I read The Eye of the World, which is the first book in the Wheel of Time series. Now, given that I don't normally read series anymore, especially ones that are so long they outlived the author, this is going to be a standalone review. The Eye of the World, being the first of 14 novels, largely functions as setup for the world and conflict that will unfold over the course of the series, though it is not without its own memorable moments. And reading it, it isn't exactly surprising that The Wheel of Time went on to become one of the highest-selling fantasy series of all time, just behind A Song of Ice and Fire, and perhaps with its own network adaptation running, its numbers will again rise and maybe overtake A Song of Ice and Fire. All that said, and I feel so bad saying this, especially because this was a patron request, but I just wasn't interested in this story. It took me a long time to warm up to Lord of the Rings, and my enjoyment of Lord of the Rings is largely due to the lens of cottagecore and my nostalgia for the films. As much as I love fantasy, my love is not for high fantasy in particular, if that makes sense. So I ended up feeling largely meh about The Eye of the World, the same way I felt meh about A Game of Thrones when I tried to read it back in college, and The Sword of Shannara back in middle school. High fantasy epics with tons and tons of characters and locations simply don't do it for me, especially if the page count is over 400. Now, this is by no means a judgment of Robert Jordan's writing or the story. I can definitely understand why someone who is a fan of high fantasy would really love this series, and I admit that its take on magic, specifically that only women can wield the One power after the Dark One managed to corrupt the male side of it during imprisonment, is rather unique and raises some interesting questions from a queer perspective. Like, would a trans woman be able to safely wield the One power? What about a genderqueer or a non-binary person? Given that these books were first published in the 90s, I don't expect there to be any consideration toward these groups beyond the first book, but it's still fun to think about. I wish the characters could have been as interesting. Egwene was probably the most interesting to me because she actually doesn't end up with Rand, and their relationship seems to be a deliberate subversion of the first woman mentioned by the male lead is his love interest trope. So that's a point in the book's favor. And yeah, that's really all I have to say about this one. I honestly am not sure I'm even qualified to review it, just like I wouldn't consider myself qualified to review erotica. I know that this genre generally does not vibe with me. I had hoped that I would enjoy it anyway, but once the main group was separated, I found myself more and more hesitant to open up the book again. Some of the world building was interesting, and I can clearly tell that Robert Jordan put a lot of thought and care into it, but I didn't share that care because I was waiting for stuff to happen, an issue that is by no means restricted to The Eye of the World. Unfortunately, this is one of the things that turns me off from high fantasy, especially long-running high fantasy as a genre. I really wish I had more to say. I wish I could point to some specific element that offended me, which I could scream at for a while, but that isn't the case. I was just kind of bored reading this through no real fault of the book's own. Maybe I would watch the show? Maybe. But I'm not exactly into watching long-running shows either. So, sorry, Roget. I'm sure that this was probably not what you wanted when you asked me to read this book, and I do want to say that I really did try, but I have to be honest. If it wasn't for the request, I would not have read this book. It doesn't mean it's a bad book, just that it's not for me. So if you are a fan of long fantasy epics like A Song of Ice and Fire or Lord of the Rings, and you somehow haven't heard of Wheel of Time already, give it a shot. You'll probably really like it.
So, Rose Garden, what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. While you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more like it. If you would like to support my writing, I highly encourage you to sign up for my newsletter on the Roselin Books website. You can also support me by making a donation on Patreon or Ko-fi. I use these funds to publish new books, and am trying to get enough funding to create audiobook editions of my works. All links are in the description. Keep growing until next time, Rose Garden.